Welcome, Tobias. Pleasure to have you here. Pleasure to have you speaking at AlchemyConf. Have you over in Braga again. Um, to get us started, can you just talk a little bit about who you are and what you've been doing in this community for the past few years?
I'm sure. Hi, glad to be here. Glad to be speaking at the conference, and especially glad to be speaking at like a community organized conference. Like we don't have many of those in the Elixir space, and that's one of the reasons why sort of like my eye fell on Alchemy Conf actually, where I was like, hey, I want to speak here because like I think we should have more community run conferences, and so I want to be here and support that. Um, but yeah, about me, what I've been doing. I've been doing Elixir since I don't know, maybe I think 2015, maybe 2014, something like that. I'll also have to see. I guess I'm best known for being like the main author and creator of Benchee, like the best benchmarking library for people to use. And I have no shame in saying that, even across programming languages. And that was also like the first stuff I did, like open source and Elixir. But since then, I've also spoken at a couple of conferences about different topics. But most recently, I spoke at Code. I actually keynoted Code BMU, which is still like a bit wild to me, talking about staff engineering. And I've worked at a couple of Elixir companies. Like the most famous one was probably my previous employer, which also originated in Portugal. And like the CEO also used to live in Braga, actually, remote. So I was a staff engineer and then a senior staff engineer at remote. Right now, I'm a senior engineer at Screenverse. And yeah, before the companies before that, I always only did like, let's say, Elixir on the side, but I did Elixir more in my free time. And funnily enough, and that's something I looked up quickly to get the year right. It's a bit of well, not a complete full circle moment, but it's funny because I spoke at a conference that you organized in Braga in 2016. It was a Ruby conference, but I talked about Elixir and Phoenix. And so that's funny because that's like, what then, 9 years ago? So that's quite funny to me.
Yeah, that's it's pretty interesting. As you said, like we've met a while ago in the Ruby community. We've now kind of moved into the Elixir community, maybe we start there. So you had like a strong background already in Ruby before going into Elixir. So what made you think, oh, I need to learn a new language?
That's a great question. And I always look at it from the perspective of sort of like, what does my current tech stack allow me to do and sort of what's missing? And the point that I got basically pushed into Elixir, we wanted to build a courier life tracking system. So I was working in a same day delivery company and we wanted to track where our couriers are. So to give like live updates and all of that. And let's say my trust in Ruby and the Ruby ecosystem for parallelism and WebSocket support and all of that wasn't great then, isn't great now. And so we were looking at other technologies to be able to handle that more naturally and efficiently. We specifically looked at Crystal, which was in a pre 1.0 version back then. So Crystal is sort of like, let's say, you could almost call it like a Ruby dialect. Like it's a language very similar to Ruby, but one that compiles basically to machine code directly. And we're looking at Elixir, and we ended up going with Elixir at the time, and that served us super well. Like I still remember writing that application and we spent more time integrating it on the front end than we spent time building the back end for that sort of like small application. And it just kept running and kept running. Like it never any issues with it. You could barely see sort of like its CPU usage, although we were throwing like tons and tons of live locations at it. And yeah, that's what got me in. But I think the more interesting question is, what got me to stay? And what got me to stay was the functional programming in the sense that I've really seen through my time working with the application. I always told people that I was better, like I was definitely a much better Ruby programmer than I was an Elixir programmer at the time. but I had a much easier time reading Elixir libraries and Elixir code than I did Ruby code, because like in Ruby, everything is this big mesh net of objects, and like the state depends on this state and that state, and then the state changes state, and it's so hard to track what's happening. And in Elixir, or like in, let's say, a functional program language with immutable state, it's more like of a story, like this happens, then this happens, then this happens. So it was so much easier to understand libraries that I've never seen before in my life. And that was fascinating. Coupled that with the good performance and like the, quite honestly, really good direction that the language has as a whole. Like Elixir has this almost curious property where they will release features in the new version that I didn't even know I wanted, or sometimes it's feature I know I wanted, I didn't tell anyone about it. The feature still shows up like in the next version or two versions. So I always felt that really Elixir had my best interests at heart, let's say.
So is that so when you switch, because obviously like grass is always greener and all that stuff. You think like, oh, I'm gonna rewrite this in Elixir, it's gonna be great. So in terms of like the biggest surprises, maybe happy surprises when moving to Elixir, was those things you just said that made you stay, or is there anything else?
I think that's mostly it. Like the functional programming, to performance, and sort of like the support, or just like how easy it was to read and extend code. But like at the same time, I gotta say, like that made me stay. But like I didn't have. So this was back in like 2015, I believe, maybe 2014 even. I not quite sure on the year numbers. But the first time that I got a full-time Elixir job, I need to look this up now. I think it was maybe, when did I start at remote? I think 2020. So it was like a whole lot of time where it was basically a hobby and maybe sometimes at work. But my first full-time job when Elixir started in 2021.
Not that long ago.
Exactly.
Uh, so looking at it from the opposite side, then what do you think are some things that Ruby does well that Elixir could learn from?
Oh boy. So that's a whole. No, there is a lot of things. Like quite honestly, like after I just was looking for a new job, I had like, let's say, a mini crisis, because I don't consider myself someone that goes after technology, basically, but like a generalist that uses whatever tool is best. But I realized that I really wanted to, if possible, take an Elixir job, and I needed to sort of justify that with myself. So I have this entire blog post in my head that like compares Ruby and Elixir on like many different ways, and why Elixir is better than Ruby in a lot of them, in my estimation. I just never wrote it so far because it's a lot. But like one thing that I have to say to, sorry, answer the question, is that I still think the Ruby community does better as a community, if that makes sense. It does better both on like diversity efforts, on like having community conferences, on like having a more general positive vibe. I mean, not that Elixir doesn't have that. Like Elixir is a good community that I like, but there were some situations where it was really jarred of like the interactions that some people had, where it was like, wow, like in I don't know how many years in the Ruby community, this never happened to me, but it happened in Elixir. And when I go to a conference or meetup and I look around, like a lot of the people look the same, right? And so that's something that's missing. And the other thing that is missing is like sort of like also really the really big breakthrough. I know we have a couple of like bigger Elixir installations, for instance, like remote being one of them, obviously. But Ruby and Rails, they power GitHub, they power Shopify, they power other really big, and so that big sort of like, let's say, industry support is also still missing. So like the one thing that I would really say is like the community and the size that's missing, or like not
Yeah,
missing, lacking. Like missing would be way too harsh.
yeah. I think we saw a few years where Ruby was the language for every startup, which then culminated with some did very well and are very big, but there's also like a big medium where there's a lot of like medium-sized companies, which Ruby's like a bigger community in that sense. Elixir also, Elixir's way younger, so maybe we'll get there. That's the hope. So for I was going to ask for Ruby developers looking to get into Elixir, what do you think is the best way to start? But maybe you can make it more generic. It's just like, what's the best way you think to start in Elixir?
Mm. I mean, let's say for Ruby developers or like for web developers specifically, I just still love the Programming Phoenix book from Pragmatic Programmers that I think is written by Joseph Lim and Chris McCord, and maybe I'm forgetting the third author. I'm not quite sure, but that book is fantastic because it gives you a really good introduction into Phoenix, but also Elixir. Like you don't need to know like a ton of Elixir to get into it. And the great thing about that book is like you get the insights from the authors of both Elixir and Phoenix into why some of those decisions were made. Why do some of these things look like they look like? And so that book has always been great. And the other thing that I would always say, especially for like basic Elixir stuff, is the platform whose name I always forget, where you get the coding exercises. The one that Angelica does. Yeah, Exorcism. Thank you very much. I always forget the name. Thank you very much. That saved me. You know, like Exorcism has just so much great content and so many great exercises. So, for instance, at Remote, I pioneered or actually pushed for us to hire non-Elixir engineers. So I have quite a bit of like experience in getting non-Elixir engineers onboarded onto Elixir and Phoenix, right? And those were of like the, let's say, boot camp that I created back at Remote. Those were two of the biggest pillars. Were like, exorcism for like, actually applying Elixir basics while learning them, and the Programming Phoenix book for learning how Phoenix works and how that all plays together in like a web application.
Yeah, good ideas, I think. To wrap up this conversation about Elixir in the community before we move to other topics, I just wanted to ask, we kind of touched that Elixir is missing maybe like more big companies, more even like mid-sized companies. What How do you think you can fix this? Slash, if someone's starting a new project now, why should they choose Elixir?
It's a great question. And it's one thing where I think we all in our community were like, yay, Elixir is the best for like starting many different types of projects because Elixir really is that broad. You can do embedded, you can do machine learning, you can do web applications, you can do all kinds of stuff and scale amazingly fast and wide. But I think we also need to get out and spread the word more. If we only talk at RubyConf and Codebeam, like that's great. I love being there, but like only Elixir and Erlang developers see those talks. And so in that case, I think we may have like a little bit of a problem of like getting out there and showing what it can do. And then the other problem is sort of like a chicken and egg problem because every time I see it being brought up or people considering it, I always see the ask of like, oh, but how do we hire enough Elixir developers because there's not enough. So even if companies are considering it because they see the benefits, they're like, oh, but is there enough basically supply of developers? And for that, I say like, it's super easy to train and like learn. Like as I said, I ran that boot camp and we had people coming from all kinds of programming languages, and I had sort of thought that they would need 3 months or something to be productive. That was my initial estimate. And most of the people were way better and way faster than that. Like most people were like really big there. And I almost gave up. But then at my old university, we had a really great, I think, doctor at the time, or like PhD, Martin von Löwes, who has like a Python award, a Python Lifetime Achievement Award for its contributions to the Python language. And he had a course about contributing to open source. So I tried again, and like I tried to fix gedit, and that also didn't work. But then in the end, like my last attempt was attending Ruby Mendicant University, where it was part of the curriculum. So it was like an online for free university where you could sort of level up as a Ruby developer, which funnily enough, it was all senior developers and me as a student. So it was a fun mix, let's say. And part of that was contributing to open source. And then I found Shoes, which was a Ruby UI building toolkit, which like some of the old heads in Ruby may remember. And like at the time, I always wanted to build like UI applications. I always thought that there should be a better way of doing that. And so I started doing that and took over a lot of that. And if anyone is interested in more of the story of me in open source, I have an entire talk titled Stories in Open Source that goes through my entire history of like where I did what, when in open source and why, and you know how that impacted me in my life. And it's been one of the most fun and rewarding journeys in many ways. Like I have many friends that I only made through open source, and like many great memories. So that's something I deeply enjoy and treasure.
Nice. So from then, you didn't touch the topic of Benchee, which you mentioned was
Ah,
like very like big library that you recommend to everybody. So why get started with Benchee? Is that something you needed for a job you were doing at the time, or?
I'm not sure if you know the story of like Kent Beck says that if he learns a new programming language, he writes a test unit framework in the language to learn the language. I write benchmarking libraries, or like at least I use benchmarking libraries. That started all the way back when I was working on Shoes, and we had some big performance issue of like the rendering performance of one of the samples was down. I tried to figure it out, and my buddy Jason, shout out to him, he taught me how to do benchmarking and profiling, and I found it so interesting. And ever since then, I've contributed benchmark libraries, ran lots of benchmarks. Like if you look at my blog, there's specifically benchmarks comparing different Ruby implementations against each other in like a Go engine that I wrote. And like I just enjoy that because like a lot of the stuff that we do at work is like you implement a feature, but you don't know does it have a positive impact or not. Like like it depends on the context, it depends on the user. Like so many things go into it. But like making something faster, I know I did something good. I know I did something better. It's like sort of like a game or a gamification, basically. And so that's how I got big into benchmarking, and like enjoyed that a lot. And so when I came to Elixir, I looked at the existing benchmark 3 blog posts about that, updating it with, new inputs, new implementations, or like just new Elixir versions, and like looking at it from that way. But like, oh, sorry. Just one more thing. Like, one of the biggest performance myths is that like you need to micro optimize everything. Like, that is one of my biggest pet peeves. Is, if you're writing a web application, you're probably making a request to a database or a query against a database. That alone usually takes like 5 milliseconds or something, or more. So if at some other place you do an optimization that cuts off 10 microseconds, it doesn't matter, because you already have a database query that takes 5 milliseconds. So it doesn't matter in the bigger scheme of things of, getting your request time down. So your time would be much better spent optimizing that query, or, putting a cache in front of that or whatever. So people sometimes just like to see these like, oh, I made something 200 times faster. But if the 200 times faster is just cutting off, 10 microseconds or even 100 microseconds, in lots of real world use cases, it doesn't matter. And so that's something I push against a lot.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so moving on to the topic of AlchemyConf, as we've mentioned in the beginning, you are speaking at AlchemyConf. I think it's gonna be great. We really think it's gonna be a cool event. But sharing as much or as little as you want. Do you want to describe what you're talking about?
That's a weird one, but I'll try. Like, I'm not sure. Like, I hope I can get people excited for this. So, my talk is titled, I believe, "Metaphors Are Everywhere: Ideas to Improve Software Development." And it's a weird one. I'm actually very happy and grateful that the conference accepted it, because it's a talk that I enjoy a lot, but it's hard to get people to understand what it's about. And the story of the talk is basically, I'll talk about basketball, fiction writing, and card games. And then I'll tell you how each of these relate to software development, what we might learn from them or not. That may sound very weird, but the point of it is that like each of these are slightly different, and they put a highlight on something else. So for instance, if you look at basketball, it's very clear that there's only one, let's say, ball that people can share. And so it's very clear if somebody's sort of like hogging the ball and like sort of like taking all the glory for themselves. That isn't as, let's say, obvious in software engineering, but it still happens. And at the same time, you can look at teamwork much better through a basketball lens than you can do in engineering. So you can learn lessons about teamwork much easier from basketball. Also in basketball, for instance, it's much easier to say what is high performing or what's winning, because at the end of the day, someone wins the championship, someone wins the game, someone has a better record, and that's tougher. And so we can learn from that. Or one of my other favorite examples is, for instance, fiction writing. There's this thing called tropes in fiction writing, where it's like these things that often happen, like, you have the outsider that comes in and knows nothing of this world. It's a common trope that like almost every story, Frodo knew nothing of the world outside, Harry Potter knew nothing of the world outside. um, but like, so that's used. And so that's kind of like a pattern in software engineering. But the thing is, in fiction writing, tropes have a negative connotation of like, oh, you shouldn't use tropes, or like, and people are super, super aware that like, if you use a trope, you need to have a good reasoning. And in software engineering, not as much these days anymore, but like sometimes people just throw patterns out for fun without thinking like, is this really like the right use case? Should we use it? And so I go through all of these, try to take lessons away, and at the end, I try to pull it all together with like a bigger message, which shall not be revealed yet, so that I don't talk about the whole talk. But yeah, that's basically the talk.
Awesome. I think it's important. You said like thanks to us for accepting it and everything, but I think it's good to have a mix of talks in conference that are not just like hardcore coding development talks, and have a mix of something to think about. And you also mentioned just being a staff engineer and all that. Does that play a role into this talk in general, or is just this fact of you're not looking at code as purely, oh, this is like write this code, then it just needs to work, but thinking in a more holistic way of what we're doing as software developers? Does that come with experience, and is that something you think people should do in general?
Most definitely. And like, I really think that my learnings from like these other topics that I'm interested in my life and that I sort of like transferred to like software development and working with people, that those immense on like staff engineering. I found that post and I was like, wow, all those years back, I was being called a glue guy. This is what like naturally I've been doing my entire life, wherever I went and whatever I did, basically. So this is a natural fit for me, the staff engineering role, doing these things. And so, yes, there's a lot of overlap and connections, I would say.
Cool. So I won't ask you to tell everybody why AlchemyConf is going to be great and why they show the 10, because I think that's a given. But I will ask you, how do you think people can best take advantage of the conference while they are there?
That's a great question. And I think one of the major things is just hang out with people, go talk to people that you've never talked before, sort of like make new friends, make new connections. Also, probably enjoy the weather. At least I hope the weather in Prague will be a lot better than it is in Berlin. But I think the other thing that I always want to say is, us speakers, we're just people. And thankfully, in this community or in most communities, we're pretty nice people. And we're actually sort of like very happy if you come to us and speak to us and give us feedback on our talk, be it positive or negative. I love to hear something where people are like, I this wasn't great, I didn't understand that, you should put it another way, or like maybe you could include this. I love to hear that, and it's always like a great experience to also for me to get to know new people. And I often feel that there is this hesitation to like go up and speak to speakers, like, oh no, like let's not bother them, and like, no, please go and talk to these people, especially at sort of like a community conference that also maybe is like a little bit smaller. It's not like a 500 people conference. Like, I don't know how many tickets you have or whatever. Maybe it's, I mean, I would guess maybe we're aiming for 100 to 200 people, like sometimes in this, like maybe more, I don't know.
Hmm.
uh,
Well, we're hopefully a little bit more.
okay,
We're
nice.
going, but it's not entirely dependent on us. We need people to want to come, and I think we'll get it's going to be great regardless. But we do have the space for a little bit more than that.
Oh, sure. I mean, that's great, but still, at these kind of conferences, especially at sort of like, an after party or during lunch, it's just such a great experience, just so much easier to get to know people and talk to them. And so, one of my funnest experience at the last conference was that somebody gave a talk actually, using Benchee for like a performance oriented talk. And so I went up to him afterwards and asked him, do you have any feedback? Is there anything you want to do better? And then in the end, we took a photo together, and that's sort of like a memory that I really cherish.
Awesome. So we're getting to the end of this. I would like us to end in a very inspiring way. So I'll, as much as we can, I don't know. So is there if you can give one piece of advice for anybody, junior engineers, open source contributors, staff engineers, just that encompasses everybody, is there one piece of advice that you would give them?
Everybody is such a big ask, but I think my advice would be that the answer to most problems is it depends. Like, there's so rarely like a right or wrong answer, a right or wrong architecture, whatever. Like, it always depends on the context onto which it is applied. So I would get to say, like, learn the business, learn the people, learn what you have, learn what you need to accomplish, and put those together and put those into the context when you make your decisions about anything, and you'll be much better off.
Awesome. Tobias, again, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you at RubyConf in less than 2 months now, I think. So almost there.
Still need to book my flights, but yes, see you there.
See you there. Bye.
Bye.